In this video, I'm going to tell you the story of Thor's journey to Jotunheim, more specifically to Utgard. Coming up. Welcome to the Northwoods Kindred. I'm your Gothi Bodvar, and on this channel we discuss everything Asatru Kindred related. So hit that subscribe button if you want to see how we do it in the Northwoods Kindred. You know, in the modern world, the only way we have to really feel connected to the gods and to our ancestors is by reading their stories. Today I'm going to talk about Thor's visit to Jotunheim, and most specifically his trials with Utgard-Loki. He's going to Jotunheim to shut him up, because every time the buds start to bloom, a cold blast comes from the north and kills off all the buds. Thor's sick of it. He wants spring to hurry up and spring. So he decides that he's going to go to Utgard and he's going to teach him a thing or two about staying in their own seasons. Of course, Loki comes in and says, Thor, you know, if you're going to go to Jotunheim, you're going to need some really, really sharp wits, and yours are about as sharp as a hammer. So Thor says, okay, fine, you can come. After Thor and Loki left Asgard, they traveled for a full day, and then they were starting to get close to nighttime, so they had to look for a place to stay, and they saw out on the edge of a field was a pretty modest shack, okay, a little farmer shack or whatever. So they decided they'll go petition those owners to stay the night. So they talked to the farmer, and he says, yes, my wife will make you dinner. When Thor sees the puny dinner, he knows that everything they have isn't enough to even satisfy his own appetite, much less everybody else's. So he offers to slay his goats and cook their meat to feed everyone. So of course they accept. Thor slays his goats, cooks the meat, serves up the dinner so that he can get his fill, and tells everybody, eat your fill, eat as much as you can hold, but don't damage the bones. Put the bones back on the hides. So everyone eats their fill and throws the bones on the hides, no problem. But the son, Thjafi, still a little bit hungry, you know, a grown boy, so Loki convinces him to break one of the bones and suck out the marrow. So he does, and he throws the bones in the pile like everything else. Come morning, Thor is irate. He brought his goats back to life by bundling them up and striking them with his hammer. They bounced back up as lively as they ever were, but one of the goats was lame. So he kicks in the door and screams to the family, who dared defy me? You lamed my goat. And he was found and determined to slay the whole family right there. But in a desperate plea to save his own life, the farmer said, I will give you my children to be your servants. Thor, as quick as he is to anger, he's just as quick to calm down. So he accepts the offering from the farmer, and he takes Thjafi and Thjafi's sister Roskva with him as servants. When he leaves his goats in the care of the farmer to tend to their wounds until he returns for them. So now they've traveled a whole nother day away from the farmer's place, and it's starting to come on nightfall again. So they're looking for a place to bed down for the night, the fog rolling in, and they spot a strange hut at the end of a long field. So they go over to this hut, and there doesn't seem to be anybody home. There's no fireplace, there's no light whatsoever, and there is no door, just a big hole. So it's kind of cave-like. And they decide that it's potentially, this is as big as any hall in all of Asgard. So they decide to bed down and wait out the night there. And then as they are falling asleep, they hear a loud roar like a earthquake. And they spring to life and they're like, this whole place is going to collapse on us. So they start running around the edges looking for a more secure location or for the exit, and they find another hall, and they run down the hall, and it seems a little more stable, so they go back to sleep and sleep the whole night through. Morning comes, and they are exiting this hall, and they start hearing some of that rumbling again. They run out of the hall so it doesn't collapse on them, and they look back, and they see a huge giant laid out there taking a nap. The rumbling was his snores. So he reached down, the giant, to collect up his things, and that house that they had weathered out the night in was nothing more than the giant's mitten, and that little hall that they went in was where the thumb goes. So obviously this is a massive, massive giant, if his mitten is as big as any hall in Asgard. Thor introduced his party, and the giant introduced himself as Skrymir, and he volunteered to be their guide to Utgard. So of course they accepted. So they travel with Skrymir as company a whole nother day, another full day. So they're coming up on their third night's travels on this journey. And they march as far as they can get, and everyone's exhausted. So the giant Skrymir, he just wants to go to sleep. He doesn't want to be bothered with food or anything else, although everyone is hungry. So he just tosses this food satchel to him, and he's like, you can have whatever's in my bag. I have to get some sleep. Giant passes out, and they go to try and untie this bag, and they just can't seem to get the knots undone because a giant. And they can't get it undone, and they finally give up, and they decide to go to bed hungry. Now, Thor doesn't like going to bed hungry, but it's even worse when he doesn't get any sleep before he starts hearing the giant snores. Loud, angry, rumbly snores that are even louder than Thor's stomach grumbling. So he finally decides that he has had enough of this giant. And he takes his hammer and he goes outside and gives a mighty blow to the giant's head. And he could feel the hammer go all the way in and smash the brains. He could feel the power in that. And he goes back to lay down. And as he turns around, the giant says, oh, must have been a stick fell out of that tree. And then goes back to sleep. And Thor is amazed. He's like, wait a second, I thought I just killed that freak. So he lays back down and forgets about it. This happens 2 more times through the night, and each time hitting harder and harder, and each time the giant making some claim of some trinket falling from the trees and landing in his hair. So Thor finally goes back to sleep just as the sun arises, and the whole party awakens, and they continue on their journey. But what they notice is far off in the distance, in a land full of fog and frost, they see a castle of ice blocks with towers with icicles, just this amazing ice castle. So the giant, Skrymir, says, there's your destination, that is Utgard, I have to go my own way now. So they part company. Now Thor and his companions make their way to Utgard, and they approach this massive gate, and they just walk right through the bars, because they're not built to keep out such puny creatures. So they go right in through the bars, and they go find the patriarch of the estate, a giant by the name of Utgard-Loki. And he says, I've heard great tales of your deeds throughout the lands, and it shocks me that you're so puny. I think I would need some proof that you are those who I've heard tales about. So Loki chimes in, and Loki says, I'm so hungry, having fasted way longer than he was comfortable with. He says, I'm so hungry I'll eat against anyone. So Utgard-Loki says, that sounds like a splendid idea. And he calls for his servants to go fix a fantastic feast. And it had all kind of meats. It had horse, it had boar, it had deer of all types. An entire table laid out from one end to the other with some of the most fantastic food available in Jotunheim. And Loki was at one side, and his cook Loki was on the other side. And when he gave the signal, they both started to eat and eat and eat, and they met in the middle. But they would look back on the table, and you see where Loki had eaten everything except the bones. Loki ate everything, including the bones, including the plates, the silverware, and even the table itself. So he was obviously declared the winner. Thor said, my companion proved that he wasn't very hungry, but I'm extremely thirsty, so I will drink against any horn you have. So Utgard-Loki says, we have a fine horn. He said, people who are very thirsty can drain it in 1 draught. People who are mildly thirsty can drain it in 2. And people who aren't very thirsty still manage to drain it in 3. So Thor takes the horn and tips it back and drinks as deep as he's ever drank before. Drinks so hard that he thinks he's gonna burst. And he knows that had to have drained the horn. But when he tips it back up, he sees he barely made a dent in it. And on Thor's second attempt, he drinks just as deep as he did on the first, and it was still nothing. And the third attempt was even worse. So in his 3 attempts to drink, barely even made a dent in the horn. Then Thor's new servant Thjafi said, I can run a race. I'm as swift as any rabbit. So the race was set up, and Thjafi would race against Hugi. They were right at the starting line, and as soon as the word go was heard, Hugi was already at the end. Thjafi was only a quarter of the way in. So now the race was over before it even began, and Thor and his company are not looking very good at this point. So the next challenge to show that they are who they say they are is Thor is willing to lift anything they put in front of him. Utgard-Loki says, "You seem kind of puny, so let's start with something small like my house cat." So Thor says, "I gotta do what I gotta do." No matter how hard he tries, he can just barely manage to lift one of the cat's paws, showing how puny he truly was. Having severely lost that round, Thor, obviously wanting another chance to prove himself, says, "I will wrestle anyone in Utgard-Loki's castle." And Utgard-Loki says, "You haven't done so well so far. The only one that I think that can really match strength with you, from what I've seen, would be my nursemaid Ellie." And he brings in his old nursemaid to wrestle with Thor. And no matter how hard Thor wrestles against this, he can't seem to resist her. He presses down on her with all of his might, but she won't seem to bend. And she gives a little push and drops him to one knee before Utgard-Loki calls it, so they don't hurt the puny little gods. So upon losing the wrestling match with Ellie, Thor and his companions decided that they're just going to cease the challenges and just enjoy the hospitality, drinking and merrymaking, and then deal with everything tomorrow. So they had a good night, and then in the morning, Utgard-Loki offered to escort them to the walls and see him on their way. He didn't lose an opportunity to boast that the gods were no longer a threat to the giants, that they felt very secure in their domain, which of course angered Thor. But when they get to the gate, this is where Utgard-Loki decides to confess. He confesses to the party that the giant who guided him in, Skrymir, was actually Utgard-Loki in disguise. So he had been with their journey from the beginning and knew what they were capable of. He also confessed that when Skrymir was snoring and Thor tried to crush his head, he confessed that he had taken the precaution of putting a mountain between the two before he went to sleep. And he pointed to the saddle on the ridge over there and said, "That is where your mighty hammer struck that mountain 3 times. And he confessed that when he left them their food bag with the knots they couldn't untie, that those knots were tied by the Norns themselves, and no man, giant, or god had the capability to untie them. He confessed that when Loki was eating against Loki, Loki was wildfire. That's why he easily devoured everything that was in front of him. And when Thor was drinking, Thor was not just drinking mead from a horn. The tip of that horn was connected to the oceans of the world, and Thor's deep drinks made a measurable difference in the tide. When Thor's servant Theofi ran a race, he wasn't running the race against a mortal being. He was running that race against thought. No one can outrun thought. When Thor was paired up against a cat to wrestle, that was no cat, that was the world serpent himself, and Thor pulled him from the ocean in his attempts to lift that cat. And when Thor was paired against Ellie, the nursemaid, because she was the only one weak enough to wrestle such a puny creature, it was revealed that Ellie represented old age, of which no man or god could resist. He confessed that had he known how strong they were, he never would have let them in the first place. And if they ever came back, he would use similar delusions to protect his realm. This made Thor extremely angry, and he raised his hammer to destroy Utgard-Loki and his castle, and it disappeared in a haze. And angry and defeated, Thor and his companions made their way back to Asgard. Failed in their mission, but with a renewed sense of self-worth and destined to sit and wait out the natural spring. And may all your failures show you how strong you truly are. Hail the folk.